All right. Welcome everybody. Thanks to Vera for that track. Eartha Kitt. Very on theme today because we're gonna be talking about evil, or at least wondering about evil. Are there evil people? Are there evil men in this world? I'm thinking about the famous phrase from George W. Bush, the axis of evil. You remember the axis of evil? Remember who was in the axis of evil? He's actually it's not a bad identity. He had North Korea, Iran, and Iraq, right? But what he really meant, he was obviously obsessed with Saddam Hussein, and he really meant Saddam, the Ayatollah, and Kim Jong-il, right? That was like, and that's part of what I think George Bush was trying to say. First of all, to use the phrase the axis of evil is to say there's an axis, like there's an alliance, there are forces of evil in this world, there's a structure of evil in this world that must be dismantled. So that sentiment is in my mind. And then I think he was also, as we know, he was going after Saddam. And I think that there was also a sense that he felt that the problem was that the countries were led by I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted. Just a lot of folks I'm noticing have their mutes on or off. So like Jane Sobo, if you could mute yourself, that'd be great. Okay. Part of what he was trying to say is that the problem is those leaders, those evil men. And I think, I'm not sure that is the problem with, geopolitical conflict, but it's at least a theory. And I think if I asked you, who are the evil leaders in the world today, you could imagine what names would start to come up. Is that too simple an analysis? Do they see us as evil? We could talk about that, but there is some notion that sometimes we fear these bad men leading these evil nations, the axis of evil. And I say all this because what I want to look at today with you all is Moses's axis of evil. Moses also has a kind of a list of the worst, the ones that you ought to remember, the ones that really, the problem in the world, the axis of evil. Now, who is on Moses's list? Not Pharaoh. Right? That's the obvious. It's going to be Pharaoh. As we can think of other kings, we just saw Balak, who we spent a whole Parsha with. He was trying to curse Israel. Are those Moses's greatest nemesis? I mean, Pharaoh, it's hard to, but it actually seems like there are two other names that Moses can't get out of his mind. The real lingering forces of evil in the world for Moses, the ones that he keeps returning to, are Sikhon and Og. Okay, so we're going to look at those two figures today and try and figure out who are these guys and what is so bad about these two kings. Okay, so let's this is like this is going to be a little bit of an investigation into the absence of a legend, because when it comes to Og, we have lots of legends. We have lots of great legends, and I've taught them in this class before, the legend of Og. But when it comes to Sikhon, the other of this axis that we're going to look at today, we really don't seem to have that much information. So first of all, why Og and Sikhon? But secondly, why do we have a whole history of Og and we don't have much to say about Sikhon? So that's like sort of the sub question today. Okay, that's okay. I think I've introduced quite enough. Let's say a blessing and begin our study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So thank God for the opportunity to keep reading the Torah. And this is one of those days, where I feel like, oh, here's something I never really thought about before. That's the feeling I have when we keep reading the Torah. It just seems like, oh, there's a whole history here that I've like spent, half my life reading the Torah, and I never really unearthed this history. So I'm going to try to do that today. All right, let's begin. Where does this kind of this question emerge? Like, who is Sikhon? Who is Og? Where do we start feeling this question? I will tell you that I feel it. I'm provoked to this question regularly on Shabbat. On Shabbat. And that is because on Shabbat and not during the week, we recite Psalm 136, famous psalm that is called, that is referred to as like a Hallel, the great Hallel. Like it's a song of praise, and one of the great songs of praise, and we insert it on Shabbat in order to praise God, Ki la'olam chasdo, for God's kindness, for God's love is eternal. And every line is God did this, Ki la'olam chasdo, and God did this, Ki la'olam chasdo. It functions a little bit like Dayenu, right? Oh, if only God had just created the world, Dayenu. If only God had just freed us from Egypt, Dayenu. It's kind of a list of all the things that God has done for us, and fair enough. I mean, that's, that seems like something we should be thinking about. That seems like a good way to build our sense of gratitude and praise. Go through all of the great deeds, great acts that God has done for us, and the Torah is full of them. Fine. So Dayenu, Ilu, if God had taken us out of Egypt, that we expect, and God gave us the Torah, God brought us to the land. But here, let me give you a source. But it's surprising to me every week, and we sing it at Ikar, so I notice it, that two of the lines are as follows. Oh my gosh, that call just screwed me up. All right, let's try to see it. All right, two of the lines are as follows. God, who struck down great kings, for God's love is eternal. Let me just give you a little context here, okay? This is Psalm 136. Okay, you can, we're just going to sort of scan it, but praise God, for God's steadfast love is eternal, made the heavens, spread the earth over the water, real start at the beginning kind of stuff, the moon and the stars, and then struck Egypt through their firstborn and brought Israel. They're just crossing the Red Sea. I mean, this is the big stuff. Drowned Pharaoh in the sea, led his people through the wilderness, my goodness. And then all of a sudden, verse 17, who struck down great kings. Here, we'll jump back to our source sheet. Who struck down great kings. Ki la'olam chasdo, for God's love is eternal. And slew mighty kings, as if you hadn't said it in the last verse. Yeah, you really killed these kings, for God's love is eternal. And then there's a verse for each of these kings. Sikhon melech Amorite. Sikhon is one of the kings because God's love is eternal. It's a funny line to say. Sikhon melech Amorite, for God's love is eternal. Og melech Bashan, for God's love is eternal. And gave their land as a heritage, for God's love is eternal. A heritage to God's servant Israel, for God's love is eternal. Okay, and then back into it gets general again. So actually, in some ways, the most specific thing that's happening here outside of Pharaoh drowning in the army is Sikhon and Og. Sikhon and Og. So who are these characters? Why are they such a big deal? And the reason that I'm stirring this up, all of this up this week, is because it's surprising in Psalm 136, but it comes up again and again and again. And here we this week are beginning the book of Deuteronomy. And in the book of Deuteronomy, there's one thing that I say every year, most important thing to remember about the book of Deuteronomy is that it's Moses talking. Moses' voice, Moses' great speech So what's Moses thinking about? What's Moses obsessed with? How does Moses want to tell the story? That's one of the questions we ask throughout the book of Deuteronomy. But take a look at the opening lines of Deuteronomy before Moses even starts to speak. These are the words that Moses addressed to all of Israel on the other side of the Jordan. Dun, 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 dun. Lots of place names, lots of times. It was in the 40th year on the first day, da, 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 da. And verse 4 of the great introduction to Moses' great speech is after he had defeated Sikhon Melech Amorite, the king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, and King Og of Bashan, who dwelt at Ashtaroth and Edrei. On the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this teaching, this Torah, and he said, okay, so I hope you can get a sense now, like, wow, that's quite strange and quite prominent. What is this constant return to Sikhon and Og, Sikhon and Og? Okay. I mean, I could stop here and say, what do you think? What is the problem? But I don't want to pause just yet, because the whole point is, I don't know, who are these characters? I mean, we do have their battles recorded. We'll look at them, but I mean, if you're anything like me, you're thinking, I don't know, right? Why are these such important figures to remember that Moses defeated these two kings? Okay, let me give you one answer, and then we'll start, and then I'll open it up and start to see what you think. Okay, let me give you one answer. Let's go. We're going to use Rashi. Rashi, the great commentator on the Torah, also has commentary on most of the Hebrew Bible. And here's Rashi's commentary on the book of Psalms. So let's go back a little bit. So Sikhon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. Why is the psalm talking about these great kings? And Rashi says an interesting thing. Great kings, Rashi says, kan Ramaz Lamed Aleph Melachim. This is alluding, hinting to who are all these great kings? The 31 kings. If you count up all of the battles that Israel went through, actually, there were a lot of kings that died in battle along the way. There were 31 of them, actually. And the psalm is comparing them to Pharaoh and his host and the plagues of Egypt, to mighty kings harsher than they. So that's quite something to say, that Pharaoh was a big deal, but these kings are even harsher than Pharaoh and Pharaoh's army. I mean, that's already quite surprising. And then Rashi says, and Sikhon was equal to all of them by himself. Sikhon kneged kulam kol echad latzmo. Okay, and then Rashi says something that he doesn't usually say, Chen ba'agada. And so it is in the Agadah, and the Agadah means in the legends. Usually, though, Rashi tells us which legend he's drawing from. And here he just says, that's the idea that we get from the legends, is that Sikhon was the worst of them all. The most destructive, terrible, evil king of them all, worse than Pharaoh and all of the other kings that we've met put together. Okay. Well, why? Why was Sikhon such a bad guy? We don't really know. So he's worse than everyone, and yet Rashi's right, there is a constant mention. Okay, and then one other thing that I want to show you before we start to open up our conversation a little bit, which is that the Rashi on the other piece of Torah that we looked at, that Deuteronomy introduces the speech of Moses and names Moses the speaker and says Moses is also the guy who defeated Sikhon and Og. What does Rashi say there? Why is it such a big deal? Why is Sikhon such a big deal? Because even if Sikhon so the language there is Sikhon who dwelt in Heshbon. Sikhon who dwelt in Heshbon, and Rashi says something that is perhaps a kind of an interpretation, although, again, it doesn't unlock too much for me. But even if Sikhon himself had not been difficult, but had lived in Heshbon, he would have been difficult because the city was a difficult place. And the word for difficult here is kasher, which means both harsh and maybe difficult to defeat. And if it had been a matter of some other city, but Sikhon had resided in it, it would have been difficult because its king at least was difficult. So how much more so now that the king was difficult and the land was difficult? In other words, it seems like what Rashi's saying is, what's the big deal about Sikhon is that it was an evil man leading an evil nation, or a mighty leader and a fierce people. And it was both, and they were just so ferocious just as a nation that's what's so bad about Sikhon. Okay, so we got a couple answers now. We, drawing from very little source material so far, but just noticing them come up again, we have Sikhon was the worst king of all, worse than Pharaoh, worse than everyone else put together. Why would that be? Okay. And answer number two, both from Rashi, not only that, but the whole Sikhon nation was a terrible and evil nation. Okay. All right. Okay. So here we are. We're like at this axis of evil. And let me just pause here and ask, does anyone see anything? Does anyone have any theories? Is there anything that's like coming up for folks when you see this reference to Sikhon and Og? I should presume not, right? We have very little to go on. That's my point. There's theories starting to come up. We notice the reference to these two, and theories starting to come up, but there's really nothing to say. Okay, so then we might as well dive into the stories themselves. And I want to just, I want to just again say the reason that we're talking about this is because we're in now the first Parsha of Deuteronomy. It introduces Moses with Sikhon and Og, and then Moses, one chapter later, is telling the story of Sikhon, and one chapter of that after that telling the story of Og. So it's almost like it's like I could just skim past this because who are these guys anyway? But they really are. They take up most of this week's, the opening Parsha to Deuteronomy, the opening speech of Moses, the great sort of oratory of Moses is introduced with the idea that Moses is the guy that killed Sikhon and Og, and then Moses really recounts it. And I'll emphasize once again what I emphasized in the Psalm, which is that Moses goes into greater detail about his battles with Sikhon and Og than he does about his battle with Pharaoh. What's going on there? How could that be true? What is it about Sikhon and Og that are so important that we've almost forgot the story of the Exodus from Egypt? Okay. All right. So let's take a look. We're going to look at a few vantage points, but here at least we can start fishing or searching for tidbits of information. Let's look at how Moses tells the story and see if there isn't anything in the story that tells us why Sikhon was such a bad dude. We'll get to Og eventually, but let's first look at Sikhon. Okay, Sikhon, here we are. This is Deuteronomy. This is this week's Parshat Devarim, and Moses telling this story. Up, set out across the Wadi Arnon, God said to Moses. I should have another verse. God said to Moses, up, set out across the Wadi Arnon. See, I give into your power. I'm going to deliver Sikhon into your hand and his land. Begin the occupation and engage him in battle. Okay, then there's some interesting language here. Today, Hayom, this day, I begin achel tet pachdecha v'yiratcha al pnei ha'amim tachat kol shamayim. Today is the day that I begin to put the dread and the fear of you upon the peoples everywhere under heaven, so that they shall tremble and quake because of you whenever they hear you mention. Okay. Go conquer Sikhon, and when you do, this is what's going to make people know that you are not to be messed with. Okay, so that's interesting. Then says Moses, I sent messengers from the wilderness of Kedmot to King Sikhon of Heshbon with an offer of peace, divrei shalom, an offer of peace. Now that's interesting too. And I said this, it doesn't actually totally make sense. God says you're going to conquer him, but Moses starts with an offer of peace. Okay. And Moses says, let me pass through your country. Ebra ba'artzecha baderech. Let me pass through your country. Baderech elech. I'm going to go right on the highway. Lo asor yaminu smol. And I'm not gonna, don't just let us take the main road. We're not going to spend any time in your country. Just let us cross. What food I eat, you will supply for money, and what water I drink, you will furnish for money. Just let me pass through. So if we eat, we pluck fruit along the way, if we hunt animals along the way, if we find water drink, I'll pay you for that. Just let me pass through. As the descendants of Esau who dwell in Seir did for me, and the Moabites who dwell in Ar, that I may cross the Jordan into the land that our God, the Eternal, is giving us. Okay, so that's the request. But Sikhon of Heshbon refused to let us pass through because the Eternal had hardened his spirit. Ki hiksha Adonai Elohecha et rucho v'imetz et livavo, and emboldened his heart in order to deliver him into your power, as is now the case. All right, now we've got stuff to talk about. Now we've got some, we could start to build a case. What do we see here that might give us some sense of what's so bad about Sikhon? What have we seen that might be a clue into why Sikhon is remembered by Rashi as the worst of all the kings that Israel ever fought? Ariella, will you start us off?
Well, what jumped out at me is the hardening of the heart.
Good. Why did that jump out at you, Ariella?
Pharaoh's heart was hardened.
Good. Okay, good. All right, that's the big gimme here, and Ariella got it. First of all, I put it in bold, right? But Ariella makes the connection, and this is an important connection. This is actually very important because the phrase is so famous to us. It's a little different here. Ki hiksha Adonai Elohecha et rucho. God hardened his spirit, v'imetz et levavo, and emboldened his heart. So it's a little bit of you're playing around with the classic phrase, because the classic phrase is hiksha et levavo. God hardened his heart, and the person whose heart God hardens famously is Pharaoh. That's a famous part of the story. We spend every year we talk about, why did God harden Pharaoh's heart? God made Pharaoh less willing to concede so that, I don't know, God could make more miracles, or I don't know, but it makes Pharaoh particularly fierce, but also strangely not in control of himself, and God's doing it. Okay, so an echo of Pharaoh. And that certainly gives you a sense of how bad this guy could be if this guy is 40 years later another Pharaoh. Okay, anything else you see in here? That's great, Ariella. What else? There's one major cruelty that's just right there in front of us. There's one. I mean, we could fish for lots of things. We could say, oh, the Pharaoh and the dread's going to be upon you. Well, that must mean he was really mighty because you could conquer him. But what's the big thing that the big affront that Sikhon carries out? Yes, Larry Zuckerman. You went.
It's hospitality. It was neutral to him, but he actually made it to be beneficial. He could make some money on the food and water. We're not going to do anything else. We just want to pass through and buy some food and water because we need it. It's neutral or beneficial to the king. And he goes, no.
Good. That's right. Okay, that's right. God says, you're gonna conquer these people. It seems like done deal, just go and invade. But Moses follows a different ethic, and it's an ethic we actually haven't even learned about yet. It's later in the book of Deuteronomy. The laws of war are such that when you go to do battle, you have to offer terms of peace. Now, that's not exactly like sweet, loving peace. It's terms of surrender. But in this case, it actually sounds that there's not, what Moses is offering is let's not go to war, which is quite surprising. God just said to go to war. But Moses is saying, just let us pass through. Just let us pass through. And why is it important that Moses be able to pass through? I should have a map for us here. But where are these places? We can intuit this. These are the places on the other side of the Jordan River where the Israelites cross over into the land of Canaan. This is sort of like the port. Okay, maybe I'll search for a map and put it up. But that's significant, right? This is the entry port into the land of. So they're going to have to go through anyway. They're just going to have to. They've come up around this way, and that's the way they have to go in. So they need this. They need this access, and Sikhon does not give it to them. But as Larry said, it seems like there's no cost to him. And in fact, if anything, he will benefit from it. So it feels like just, I don't know, what do you say? Cruelty? It's a little hard to just say that he's being mean when you can speculate about other strategic interests that he has in mind. I don't know, maybe he doesn't want these people, becoming a powerful nation across the, I don't know. But it is striking the way he doesn't let him cross through. No. And then they go to war and the Israelites win. So bad move, Sikhon, but it does give you a sense of maybe how vicious he is. Okay, so good. So we've got Ariela's connection, which is that he was Pharaoh-like in that his heart was particularly hard. And we've got Larry's framework here that points out that not only was he not open to our words of peace, but that it seems like there was no reason for him to deny us other than to do us wrong. Okay, so we could keep speculating a little bit there. Anything else you see in this passage you want to take note of, Kathy?
Well, I sort of a obvious point here, but he compares the descendants of Esau and the Moabites. I mean, it's like, they're always kind of bad guys and everything. And being an Esau defender, I'm attuned. But here, it's even these other enemies allowed this. So it's Sikhon is even worse than the other enemies. So
okay, yeah, that's really good. Okay, thank you, Kathy. That's right. We saw, let's put this up, and then I am going to try and Google a map because I think it's starting to get too confusing without a little visual. But just let me pass through as the descendants of Esau who dwell in Seir did for me. Those are not my friends. That's not a friendly nation, but they still let us pass through. And the Moabites who dwelled in Ar. And, we don't have great relationships with the Moabites either, but look, they at least let us walk through. But Sikhon refused. Okay, so Kathy's right. There's some sense that, and this is part of when we think about Sikhon and Og. This is what I mean by the axis of evil. We have, or they had. I don't know if we still have. We have lots of enemies in the ancient world. There's lots of tension in the region that we refer on the east side, right? Egypt's down south. Canaan/Israel is north of Egypt, right? They come up this way. I'm going to put a map on that. And then what we're talking about is the east of Eden, right? The east of on the other side of the Jordan, the whole region that we refer to as Midian. Midian is a vast region that includes many nations. Here, I'm going to start to put up, let me get you a map because this is just getting way too difficult, at least for me, to keep in mind. Okay, so here we go. Here's one. I'm just like randomly Googling stuff, but whatever. Okay, here's Canaan. Here's the crossover. This would be Bashan, where Og rules, and this would be Heshbon, where Sikhon rules. So you can see this is the crossover into Canaan. But you see there's Moab and Edom and Ammon. There are many enemy nations, or at least tense nations here. I'm gonna see if I can, maybe I'll just like find another one. Let's say there's one. This is not very helpful, is it? But I guess we got it. But you know what? Let me say one other thing. In this confusing and messy conversation that we're having. It's also true that the region of Bashan, Og's area, and Heshbon, Sikhon's area, eventually, when they're conquered, there's another thing that happens in the story, which is that 3 of the tribes of Israel take over that land permanently, and that becomes their territory. So that also is interesting. Like this is an important passageway. It's an essential passageway. And then it becomes, so for those of you who like to think more of like I'm looking at Hal, I'm looking at Matt, like think about the ancient world, the strategy, the history, the military concerns of the ancient world. Some of this, maybe that land, that territory was crucially important. And if there's any sense that they're not going to let us pass through, we got to kill these guys. So that there's an analysis there to be made. And actually I see Matt has a hand raised. So let's hear from Matt.
Well, one of the things that is really striking me here is that the 3 books of wandering are in an empty world. We're wandering through the desert, and anytime we feel like it, we put down tents and we spread out. And all of a sudden, we're in this crowded world.
Yeah.
That, I'm not thinking so much of ancient Israel politics, but just as the world described is a very different. This is a world packed full of kings we have to be careful. Where was this crowd and settlements, in the last 3 books? It was, they show up when they need them, but it's a different world. That's all.
Good. Such a helpful comment. Matt says a very simple thing that really helps us frame not just our conversation now, but the whole journey of the Israelites through the desert, which is to say, it started with a great battle and it ends with a series of great battles, but in the middle, it's relatively quiet. Not that they didn't encounter danger in the desert, they did, but it's the desert. It's the desert, and it's not a place of settlement. It's not a place that people are fighting over. The Sinai Desert, they're just wandering through for 38 years, right? So there's also, that's, first of all, just a very good point. And as Matt makes it, it's like, it was the desert, but now as they start to come up out of the desert, now it's like nation. And we what the Middle East is like now, right? It's all these little nations and a lot of fighting over territory. I remember reading Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver. And he is taking a class that he awakens to become like a mega intellectual in prison. Right? He's like a revolutionary, Black revolutionary in America and in the 1950s and 60s. And he awakens to become a real intellectual. And one of the moments that he describes stimulating his mind is a teacher he had in prison who is doing some history of the ancient world. And he says the teacher is talking about all the conflict that's existed in this region over all of these years. and the teacher says, and the way that Eldridge Cleaver describes it, it's like it's the teacher almost in tears says, all of this blood spilled over a highway. And that really made an impression on me, because what he was saying was that this teacher was explaining that the conflict over this region is because everybody has to pass. The Middle East as a region is a connecting point between Europe and Asia and Africa and South Asia, right? It's this middle point, and the Mediterranean, and right. So everybody's colliding into this region. And then I'm thinking of that story, the way that Matt is framing our understanding. And now we're getting somewhere, because I think Matt is quite right to say, this year of entry into the land of Israel is quite different than the previous 38 years. And now we can begin to ask the question, why is Sikhon more looming in Moses's mind than Pharaoh? Because I don't know, maybe because Pharaoh was 40 years ago. But Sikhon, these are the last great battles before they cross over. Okay, so that's also part of our story. Matt, did you want to add something?
I'm confused here. Are these battles at the end? Or is he recounting things that happened during the 40 years?
No, these battles are at the end. These are at the end. Okay. At the end. And the Torah, in some ways, we talked about this at one point, Torah sort of famously quiet for 38 years. In other words, we get the first year of their journey in the desert, and then at a certain, and some of the early episodes of Numbers are thought to be in that first year. Of course, this dispatch of the spies, the battle with Korach, some of the great stories of Numbers. But then there's like a kind of a fast forward. Nothing seems to happen, and they're almost at the land of Israel. So it's 38 years fast forward, and then we get the last year, which includes some final battles. Okay. And that's where the battles of Sikhon and Og are. But by the way, there are other battles. It's not even the last battle. The last battle was there are more Midianite kings that they had to kill, right? So, and maybe this is what Rashi means. Oh, there are lots of kings, but no one like Sikhon. No one like Sikhon. Okay. Now, I want to just say one thing here, and then I'm going to turn to Yael's comment. Sikhon, I keep saying. And why am I not talking about Og? Og, the other king, a much cooler name, right? Og. Sounds like a monster. Sounds like a giant. And that is, that is in fact what the legend says that Og was. So I want part of my whole reason for taking us down this thorny path is that, as I said before, Og's got a legend. We know we've got plenty of great source material for Og, and the legend of Og also starts in our Parsha, in Deuteronomy. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but the important verse here to see is in chapter 3 of Deuteronomy. So chapter 2, we have this whole story of Sikhon we just looked at, and we ended in that line that Ariella really picked up on, that the Eternal had hardened his spirit and emboldened his heart. Great connection. Then chapter 3, we made our way up the road towards Bashan, and King Og took the field. Don't worry, God said, we're going to defeat him too. And we do defeat him, and we defeat all the towns around him, et cetera, et cetera. We doomed them as we had doomed the king of Sikhon, and on and on and on. And then the last thing that it says in the story is that only King Og of Bashan was left of the remaining Rephaim. Now, Rephaim, what are Rephaim? The commentaries are speculating, Rephaim are like a certain class of people or a certain legendary group of people who were, well, as you'll soon see, who were enormous. And the way that the Torah makes that point is to say his bedstead, meaning the place where Og slept, an iron bed is now in Rabbah of the Ammonites. They kept it as a memory, his bed, and it's 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide by the standard cubit. A cubit is like 3 or 4 feet. So we're talking about like someone who is like 30 or 40 feet tall by the record of his bed. Okay, that's the Torah's doing that itself. The legends just explode. And I wrote I have a book coming out this fall, and I wrote a whole essay on the legend of Og. There's like such great stuff. I mean, the legend of Og is like, you could just, you know, we'll have that class. We've had it before and we'll have it again. But a lot of what I'm trying to do in this class is to say, okay, but Moses always says Og and Sikhon. Where's the legend of Sikhon? Where's the legend of Sikhon? So you can see how these two figures are kind of compared, and one gets a legend of his own. The other one, we never fully unearthed the legend. And Rashi is giving us version. Oh, he was the worst king of all, but why? Why? Okay, so let's continue exploring that. Yael.
Well, I don't have an answer for why he was the worst king of all, but it's reminding me that this sort of tendency of our hearts to look towards peace, and when they were offering Sikhon, please let us come through. You know, we've been fighting so much and we've had to kill everybody, and maybe we can just make peace with you. But it reminds me of the admonition against Amalek. Don't forget, you have to get rid of these people, because if they didn't, they're their enemies. So God hardens Sikhon's heart. Well, he hardens his spirit against Moshe, and he says, I'm going to fight these guys because otherwise they're going to be neighbors of mine, and they're going to hate me, and they're going to fight with me forever.
That's great, Yael. Ariella did us the favor of connecting the legend of Sikhon to Pharaoh. Yael does us another important connection, which is the connection to the nation of Amalek. And that's another big, well-discussed topic in Jewish literature. Amalek, who is thought to be our ultimate nemesis because they attacked us when we were vulnerable and just leaving Egypt. And you got it. This nation is so dangerous that the Torah, in this case, and it, you know, it's disturbing. I mean, but for another class, like the Torah tells us we have to kill all of them, like genocide, because kill every Amalekite, because this is a nation that is predatory and will never stop coming after you. I always think of the Borg, right, from Star Trek. Right? It's just like you will be assimilated. Right. And so Amalek is this idea of there are some nation, the axis of evil, right? And as Matt said, it's not Moab. It's not Edom. Those nations we have problems with. They commit idolatry. We get into fights with them, but that's not the same thing as a certain kind of nation that is just a danger in the world. And as Yael says, certainly a danger to have right across the river from you. Okay, so that's an important clarification also, is to use Amalek as a reference point for thinking about what kind of nation it is that actually has to be put out of business. And I say this, I'm sort of like casually, I realize there's something irresponsible about casually kind of alluding to questions of like massive global geopolitical significance and, you know, and the implications of defeating a nation when you will have to kill, you know, not just soldiers, but citizens, right? These are dangerous questions to ask. And I don't ask them as a strategian, right? But it is important to frame our thinking with some of these questions, because they're real questions that leaders in our world have always had to ask. Are there certain forces, certain nations, certain groups that are dangerous? And I think this is what Rashi was also alluding to when Rashi said it was a terrible king and it was a terrible people, and everything about it was just fierce, and they would come after you like, you know, you're gonna die when you encounter these people, and so you have to strike first. Okay. All right. Let's turn back to Larry, although I think it's not Larry, but yeah.
Thank you. Hi, thank you.
Tell me your name again.
It's Laura.
Laura.
Thank you. This is a really good series of insights. I wanted to circle back briefly to the nature of evil, why this king would be considered to, be the top dog in the evil nation. And there might be something to that. So in other words, what we have here is an offer of peace, and it's gratuitous for that king who has great power and privilege to say no, which suggests something which would be the arbitrary exercise of power, which also could be interpreted as abusive. And when we begin to see this kind of arbitrary exercise of power, as an example, let's go back to Pharaoh just briefly and say, he hardened his heart, God hardened his heart, but he had his reasons, even if we don't agree with his reasons, and he had a list. This guy has no reasons. It's completely arbitrary and unreliable.
Good. Thank you so much for that, Laura. That's right. That deepens the questioning that we were just doing. Like what is it that makes this such an axis of evil nation? And Laura's saying, well, let's think about evil. And let's think about some of the details that we've been reviewing here, notably the denial of safe passage. And as Larry said, when there was no when it would have been even to your benefit. And it seems, Laura says, coming from the same Zoom box, it seems that at least the simple way to read this is that Sikhon wanted us to suffer, and that Sikhon, something about his own, he got off on his own power. Like he enjoyed the fact that he was powerful and could make people suffer. And that's a distinction. And there are, it's too easy sometimes to be like, oh, the evil men running, bad, you can fill in the blanks, right? Bad this leader. But usually that's like, come on, it's not about that one guy. It's a whole history and nation and conflicts and cultures and, but sometimes you get the feeling that the person who landed in that top position loves being powerful and loves exercising that power in the form of cruelty. And that's what Pharaoh was, and that's what Sikhon is. Someone who enjoyed. I was just watching Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? It was like all these scenes with Darth Vader, and that's what Darth Vader represents. That's what the Empire represents in the Star Wars mythology. It's just someone who wants to make you suffer, wants you to know the point of their rule is to establish that you will be submitted before them. And that's a certain kind of leadership, and that kind of leadership perhaps is what Sikhon and Og represent, and why they're so dangerous. Okay, great. All right, we have 8 minutes left. And there's one more important piece of text that we have to consider. And I think there's at least one more clue that, we've done a lot of good work now in trying to figure out what was so bad about Sikhon. But there's one more important clue, because yes, Og has all of these legends. It has this verse where he was so big, and all these legends develop around Og. And I encourage you to look at the legend of Og, really wild stuff. But Sikhon, where is the legend of Sikhon? Remember, Rashi said, oh, so it is in the Agadah, he is the worst king of all. Where's the legend? The truth is there's a kind of a legend of Sikhon recorded in the Torah itself. Because remember, Moses is recounting the battle of Sikhon, but that battle took place back in the book of Numbers. So we're going to go back and look at the book of Numbers. We're going to get most of the same information that Moses gave us, but then you'll see. Okay, so let's take a look. Last major piece of text today. Okay, so Israel now sent messengers to Sikhon, king of the Amorites, saying, let me pass through your country. We will not turn off it. This is back now in the book of Numbers. We'll not turn off into fields or vineyards. We'll not drink water from wells. We'll follow your king's highway until we've crossed your territory. It's always interesting to compare Deuteronomy account to Numbers to earlier in the Torah, and Moses often makes interesting switches, but we're not going to pay that much attention to today because it's mostly the same story. But Sikhon would not let Israel pass through his territory. Sikhon gathered all his troops and went out against Israel in the wilderness. He came to Yahaz and engaged them in battle. But Israel put them to the sword, took possession of their land, etc., place names. And Israel took all those towns, etc., place names. And Heshbon, now look at this last line. Heshbon was the city of Sikhon, king of the Amorites, who had fought against a former king of Moab and taken all his land from him as far as the Arnon. Now that's interesting information. Sikhon is known to have taken land from other kings in the region. Probably shouldn't surprise us at this point. And in fact, you may remember this because we read this at the beginning of Parshat Balak, another one of our enemy kings that Moses doesn't seem to care too much about it after the fact. Balak, son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites, and Moab was alarmed because the people was so numerous, and Moab dreaded the Israelites and said, wow, now they're going to get us. Why? Because they saw what they had done to the Amorites. Balak, who was king of Moab at that time, okay, but earlier there was a different king of Moab, and Sikhon had taken all of their land. So there's history there. Okay, fine. So that's one point. But the last thing that I want to show you is quite unusual, is that the Torah stops and gives us a little poem. And I don't know exactly how to translate this. Al Kain Yomru HaMoshlim. The translation in Safari is, therefore the bards would recite. But a mashal is more like a parable. So it's like they would tell a little story about this, and this story is supposed to teach you something about who Sikhon was. So this is the legend of Sikhon. This is the thing that we actually should have been paying attention to all along. So let's read the poem. It's not very easy to understand, but let's see if there are any last clues in this poem, in this mashal, this allegory, this, I don't know, how do you say, the bards would recite. Let's see if there's anything left for us to understand about Sikhon here. Okay. Come, Bo Heshbon, come to Heshbon, firmly built, and well-founded is Sikhon's city. For fire went forth from Heshbon and flame from Sikhon's city, consuming Ar of Moab and the lords of Bamot by the Arnon. Okay, that's not easy to understand, but seems like, boy, they burst out like a fire. Woe to you, O Moab! You are undone, O people of what is that? Woe to you, O Moab! Oy lecha Moab, avarta am Kamosh. You are done, O people of Kamosh. His sons are rendered fugitive, and his daughters captive by an Amorite king, Sikhon. Yet we have cast them down utterly. Heshbon, along with Dibon, we have wrought desolation at Nophah, which is hard by Medeva. I don't know what that means. I don't think it's near, which is near Medeva. So Israel occupied the land of the Amorites. Okay. Now, what is the most interesting piece of information we got from this little poem? Oh, they were so mighty and they attacked all the regions, but we got them. But there's one other little piece of information there. You see it? See the other thing that Sikhon is known for besides taking the other land of the region? What was the other thing that he does? What is the other thing that he does? Woe to you, Moab! You are undone, people of Kamosh. His sons are rendered fugitive, and his daughters captive. Right? Natan banav pletim uvnotav bashvit. Lamelech Emori Sikhon, the king of the Amorite Sikhon. So Sikhon was not just the kind of guy that wouldn't let you pass through. Not just the kind of guy that's taking all of the land in the regions that he can get. And think about axes of evil and what we fear in terms of them spreading and taking over. But he was also, we now learn, I guess we learned earlier, he was also the kind of king that once he conquered you, all of your children would be taken captured, and the men would be conscripted, and the woman would be, well, what do you think the woman would be conscripted for? He's going to turn your sons into his slaves and your daughters into his concubines, right? So that's an important snippet of information there. We've been building this case against Sikhon. Why was Sikhon the worst? Well, I mean, certainly we got to add this in the case, is that not only strategically did he own the land that we needed, not only did he prevent us from getting there, not only, et cetera, all of the things we've been saying along, but he was the kind of person who was going to take your children away and do with them as he wished. And that's what made him so especially terrifying. Okay, let's take one last comment from Payam.
I'm just thinking about the lack of information and about Mouse and Vonnegut, about the human imagination is far worse than the truth. And if you tell the truth, people don't believe it. You know, Mouse is about the Holocaust. And when he was talking about the Holocaust, he decided to use mice and cats to break through. And when Vonnegut was talking about his World War II experience, he turned into a weird sci-fi novel. So I think the Bible, and not giving us information, it's just saying he's so bad we can fill it in the blanks. And our imaginations are far worse than what they could have written.
Good. That's a great note to end on. And I love the way you framed that, Payam. That's what we've been trying to figure out all along, is exactly that sort of lack of information, the way that the Torah, and not just the Torah, but the book of Psalms, the book of Judges, the book of Joshua, keeps returning to the great last battles of Moses, Sikhon and Og, and yet doesn't really tell us what was so bad. Why are those the final battles to remember? Why are those so burned in Moses's brain and in the brain of the later composers of biblical literature? We don't know, but as Payam says, when we don't know, let the legends fly. Right? And with Og, we've got such juicy material to work with, right? Because he's apparently gigantic. So he himself, we can just think of as a monster, a giant, but Sikhon, we have even less information, but I think we've done a good job in this class, at least beginning to construct a case that would help us understand why these two figures stand out in Moses's historical memory, even more than Pharaoh, as his axis of evil. Okay. Great learning with you all. I'll see you next week. Shabbat Shalom.